Today in the shop, we're going to build a water ice tank for our ZL1 so we can drop those IATs. What's up guys, we're back in the shop, and today we're going to address one of the biggest issues with the ZL1, heat soak. These cars use a water to air intercooler system, which works great until the water gets heated to a point that it can no longer pull heat from the air charge effectively. So there's two ways to fight this. You can either add a more efficient way to cool the water, like tying into the AC system, or you can expand the system. The more water there is, the longer it takes to heat it up, and since an AC system really isn't an option for us, we need more capacity. There are multiple tanks you can buy for this already. However, I want to carry a minimum of 6 gallons of water with full use of the trunk and the peace of mind of not having to worry about leaks or janky fittings or anything like that, so we get to make one. Now the first step is to remove the aftermarket tank that this car came with, then empty the trunk and prepare it for the install. Let's get started. So this car already has an expansion tank. It's an aftermarket unit from Cordes Performance, and it's 2 or 2.5 gallons, I forget which. It's great for making burping the system easier, but it doesn't add enough capacity to really help with heat soak. So we're getting this out of the way. It just mounts to the radiator shroud. And once that's out of the way, we're gonna move on and actually remove the factory water pump also. Not only are we going to relocate the pump to the back of the car, but we're also going to replace the pump with a high flow Stewart water pump. However, we're going to wire the new water pump into the factory water pump controls so we can still control it with an Aeroforce or HP tuners, and it still has the delay and everything. It will work just like an OEM pump, just be much higher flow. With that out of the way, we can move to the trunk. All the modules in this little spare tire area need to come out of here. The great thing about this modification is there's no wiring required. All the wires reach after we've relocated everything. So we're going to start by getting these modules out of the way, unbolt them, tuck the wires out of the way, and I'm actually removing the wire harness itself because later in the video I'm actually going to insulate the entire trunk to help with heat and some noise as well. To get this stereo module out of the way, so we're repeating the same thing on the other side, getting the modules out of the way, disconnecting the wiring, and then we're going to come in and remove that wiring harness as well. With everything out of the way, we can come in and we can cut all the studs that those modules mounted to off, then grind them down flush. We're also going to come back with a stripping wheel and strip a lot of the seam sealer in here. I don't really know why there's seam sealer here because there are no seams, but it's in the way and we want our tank to sit flush. So we're going to clean this whole area up, then come back, vacuum it out, and then we can start with the heat and sound installation. This is not Dynamat, although it looks and works pretty much the same. It's actually made by a company called FatMat. And it installs the same. Honestly, by holding the product, you can't tell the difference. Great thing about this kit was I ordered a 25 square foot, was like 70 bucks. Came with a roller, it came with a knife, it came with everything that I needed to do the entire trunk. I did everything you see here, and I also did the rear wheel wells, and I still have a decent amount left over. I could come back and do some more if I wanted to. I'm just going through here, making cutouts around all those ground points so we have a good ground connection once we connect the harness back up. This is pretty straightforward stuff. Make your clearance cuts, use the roller, knock it down, make sure it lays flat, and that's pretty much it. With that done, we can come back and start reinstalling the harness. Everything in this area goes right back where it was before. All the grounds go back to the same point. All the harness attachments go back to the same point. The wiring harness for the tail lights and the NPP actuators go in the same place. And then we're going to repeat the same exact process on the other side. We're going to go ahead and feed that harness for the tail light and the NPP actuator back through. And same thing over here. Everything on this side goes right back where it was. Grounds are in the same place, connectors are in the same place. There's no modifications here whatsoever. We're gonna put this in, make sure everything is tightened down. Then we can start relocating modules. I used 2 bolts on the audio module you can see here. I mounted it up in that little cubby area on the driver's side. And the harness reaches with no modifications. Took a little manipulating, a little bending because it's kind of preformed, but plug and play, no wiring required. I wanted to install the battery because I want to make sure as we relocate modules to this side that I don't get anything in the way that would prevent me from pulling the battery later. Obviously the battery is going to come in and out far more than these modules ever should. And this is the one hole I had to drill for this bolt right here. I had to remove the passenger side wheel liner and drill a hole and run that bolt in there. It doesn't interfere in anything. I don't get tie rub from it. There are actually a couple lines that run through there and it sits inside the lines. With everything out of the way, now we can get started on the tank. Now I've taken some measurements and I'm gonna first build a mock-up out of cardstock. Once I'm happy with the mock-up, I'll cut the pieces out of steel. Then we're gonna take everything over to the garage fab shop and we're gonna make this look like a water tank. So this is just cardstock. You can buy a pack of it at Office Depot for like 10 bucks or something like that. And I taped it together to make my bottom template. And now I'm gonna cut up some pieces to make the sides, tape everything together. I did this a couple times just to kind of dial in the shape and the fit that I was looking for, make sure everything is gonna work before we transfer this to steel. And in between here, I'm going over to the car, checking stuff, coming back, making my cuts. Once we have it here, we're gonna take this template, we're gonna transfer it over to the steel. Now we're using steel because aluminum was actually unavailable locally and I didn't wanna wait for it. Weight's not a huge concern for me here. It's gonna be powder coated, so rust isn't a concern. So steel will do the job. So we're gonna mark all the lines here. Then I'm gonna come in with the angle grinder, throw a cutoff wheel on it. We're gonna cut this up. First cut this into some manageable pieces. Then we'll come back and trim the edges and make our big cuts. Then once we're done with that, we'll take it to the bandsaw, cut off the corners and the edges. You also might notice that my lines on the panel are different colors. Green is where I'm supposed to cut, and orange is where we're going to bend the panel later. It's just a little trick that I learned, and it helps when you're cutting these up so you know if you're cutting the right piece or cutting the right spot, and you don't end up wasting a piece of material.
Hey everyone, I'm Aaron with Garage Fab, a YouTube channel designed to show aspiring fabricators that they don't need a huge shop to build big, badass projects. We build everything from air suspension to furniture while using the most space-efficient tools possible. I've been asked to help build a water storage tank for the ZL1. A cardstock mock-up has already been made, which is brilliant. Not only can you use a mock-up to make sure the part you're making fits, but you can disassemble it and use it for templates to help create those shapes in a tougher material. Even with the mock-up, I'm guessing building the steel version is going to be a challenge. The box and pan brake we're using works wonders when building a regular box, but our water tank has a really unique shape that's likely going to push the brake to its limits. We're gonna make as many bends as we can on the brake, and if necessary, we'll whack it with a hammer to finish it off. Lastly, we're gonna put a step roll in the top panel with a bead roller for a little structure and flair.
So it turns out the Garage Fab YouTube channel is also local to me. They're in Vegas as well. And Aaron reached out a while ago and mentioned doing some sort of a collab and said if I ever need any help with anything. So this was a great opportunity for us to work together. He has already done this project for a fuel tank, albeit a much easier shape to work with, but I don't have a brake and I honestly don't intend on buying a brake. So this was a great opportunity for us to finally meet and work together on a project. So you can see he's bending the rough shape here. We can't get it 100% like he mentioned because of the shape, but we can get it 90% and then take it into the shop using a little bit of persuasion. You kind of force this into place where it needs to be. While he's working on this, I want to take 2 seconds to talk about the GarageFab YouTube channel. If you guys haven't checked it out already, I highly recommend this channel, and it would mean a lot to me if you would check them out. I feel like it's hard to find channels that have good content, good quality, production value, and still have the information that you want. And the GarageFab YouTube channel does that. It checks all of those boxes. They have a Mitsubishi Mighty Max, I believe it's a lowrider that they're building. There's hours and hours and hours of video on their channel, and it's all great stuff. Definitely recommend them. If you haven't checked them out already, please do so. I will drop the link in the description below. This top piece for the tank, because it's flat sheet metal, is really flimsy, and if we were just to put it on the tank as is, the middle of this lid would want to sag. So we're adding a step roll to it using the bead roller, and that gives it some structure, and that structure will prevent that panel from bowing in the future. And it adds a little bit of style to it as well. You can get crazy with these and do multiple shapes and all kinds of patterns. This is just a basic perimeter. It's just 1 inch off the edge and it goes all the way around the perimeter. Nothing fancy. I just wanted it for mostly for structure. I've seen this done before, but this is the first time I've seen it done in person. And I'm sure Aaron's making it look easier than it really is. You can tell he's very precise about it, but it worked perfectly and I'm very happy with how it came out. Huge thanks to Aaron and the GarageFab channel. If you haven't checked them out already, be sure to do so. I'll put a link in the description below. For now though, we're back in the Reckless shop, and the next step is to get this tank welded up. I'm just gonna MIG this together because we're grinding it down flush so that it fits, and MIG is just faster for big jobs like this. Once the lid is welded on and the joints are all welded, I'll add some fittings and some mounting tabs, and this tank will be ready for powder coat. So the lid for this tank is actually a billet one piece from Rhodes race cars. And we're using that over the plastic lid that a lot of the tanks use, mostly because it doesn't leak. Those plastic lids are not the greatest quality, they don't have the greatest construction, and they let moisture and air through. So we're making an access hole for the flange to fit using the body saw. And we're gonna come in, we're gonna mark all of the holes to mount this flange using the punch. I'll come back with the 1/8 inch drill bit, drill all those holes out. Then we can come back off camera with a bigger bit, open them up, and dial in the final fit of the flange before we weld this tank up. First thing we have to do here is position the top and get a couple tacks on it just to kind of hold it in place. Then I'm just going to work my way around the perimeter, dialing it in and just putting tacks every so often just to hold it together and get the general overall shape. That way we can make sure our fits are tight, our panels line up, and we can have everything kind of locked in before we come back and final weld it up. So I'm adding 2 fittings on the bottom here. One is the feed, this will gravity feed out to the pump, and the other is a drain. So if we want to fill this tank up with ice and circulate the water and cool it off, we can drain the hot water. We need a couple extensions to get through the body of the trunk and clear everything. Then I'm going to come in here and add some AN fittings so we can connect our hoses. As I'm sure you're all noticing, there is no way for me to finish weld that fitting, so I ended up having to cut all that off. That's why there's no footage of it. I had to redo it off camera and then weld it onto the tank. But this one for the return was able to be done on the tank, so I got everything tacked up there, and then we're gonna go ahead and add some mounting feet so we have a way to mount the tank in the car. I'm just making sure that they're level because this is a rounded edge from us bending the tank. So we can come in and tack those feet on and then move on to welding this tank. So I'm trying to bounce around a little bit so I don't put too much heat in it, but I'm also moving a little quick because I don't really care what this weld looks like, because it's all going to get knocked down anyhow. So we're pumping it full of wire so we don't burn through anything, because we're working on edges, but overall, not a big deal. Side note, don't do what I just did, because I burned the shit out of my left arm doing that. If you notice, I'm also shooting up a little bit. This lid has a little bit of an overhang on it, and I'm using the welding process to kind of melt that overhang away so that I don't have to come in and cut it and grind it later. We'll just come in once the weld is done and knock the weld down so we have everything the way we want it. This tank came out perfect, guys. It's at the powder coaters right now, and while we wait for that, we need to run new lines from the tank up to the engine bay. The lines into and out of the new pump will be 1-inch diameter, but the lines running to the engine bay will be 3/4 inch diameter, and we're going to use a Motion Raceworks Firewall bulkhead to keep everything clean. So this Firewall Passthrough is from Motion Raceworks, and it's a billet deal, and you can probably see as the panel distorts from my punch tool just how thin this sheet metal is in the back of the car. So if we were to not use this and just drill holes and put a grommet in it, I'm not convinced that we wouldn't have rubbing or chafing or some sort of an issue, even with a grommet. It wouldn't look that great, and then it would also negate all of the work we just did to insulate the trunk by having this huge opening where exhaust or noise or anything can pass through. So we're using this billet plate. It's really easy to install, 6 holes. As you can see here, 4 for the plate, 2 for the hoses. Super simple stuff. I'm just gonna hit these with a hole saw and open it up, and then I'll come back with a file and kind of dial it in off camera, and then we're ready to install it. I actually screwed up the hardware, so I had to go buy new hardware for it. That was my fault. Once it's installed and tightened down, I'm also going around the edges with a little bit of gray RTV just to fully seal this up so we don't have to worry about any exhaust fumes or anything leaking through it. And then we're going to add the fittings on the outside. These are all orb fittings, so we have our O-rings. Then we can move on to the quarter panel. Now I've seen people try and route the hoses through the subframe. I've seen them over the rear tire, through the wheel well. To me, those are not the right way to do it. We don't want this hose touching anything. We don't want to have rub issues from a bigger tire. So this area right here is actually open to the trunk in the front of the wheel well. So I'm drilling 2 holes using the body saw to connect them to make them an oval ellipse kind of shape, and then using the sanding wheel on the Dremel to come in and knock those edges down, smooth it out, kind of round that edge off so we don't have to worry about cutting the hoses. And then I'm actually going to come in and make my own grommet. Because this is kind of a weird shape, you can't just buy a grommet for it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a piece of vacuum hose, cut it to length, and just take a razor blade and run a slit right down the side of it. And then that will basically make a grommet. And we'll take it, we're just going to press it in there, and friction will hold it in place, and now we have a grommet. These hoses are going in the trunk and up over the wheel well and coming out where we relocated those modules on the driver's side. This way they're tucked up out of the way. Then we can install our fittings on the inside of that firewall block, and we're changing fitting size here because we're stepping down. Our feed out of the pump is 1 inch, so that's a -16, but our feed up to the car is a 3/4 inch. And from rough math, I believe that's a -12. And we're just going to use some push lock fittings on these hoses, put it together, and tighten it all down. The hoses that run through the rocker panel need to be secured, and I don't see a lot of people do this. They just kind of run it through the rocker and let it just sit there. You have to remember, these are going to be full of water, they're going to be heavy, and you don't want them flopping around in the rocker panel or causing the rocker panel to sag. So I'm just using a riv nut tool, a couple of clamps, and some hardware, and these are now solid mounted, so they will not go anywhere. We don't have to worry about sagging, vibration, noises, anything. I personally am not a fan of these padded clamps. I just don't like the way they look, but for this, they do get the job done. We'll never have to worry about them, and they're out of sight, so I can live with it. Same thing up front. As these hoses go through the fender, we're also going to secure them. There was already a hole here. I just opened up a little bit, added my riv nut, and repeated the process with the clamps and a bolt to tighten everything down. One of these hoses runs into the engine bay, it will go up to the blower, and the other one runs down to this intercooler right here. We're just going to cut it to length, throw the factory hose clamp on it, stick it on there, and then clamp it down. The last step in this process is to mount the pump and install the tank. I'm going to build a mount for the pump so that it's solid, but the tank can still gravity feed into the pump. Once that's done, we can install the pump, install the tank, fill it with water, and burp the air out of the system. So we're using a scrap piece of that same steel we used to make the water tank out of to build our bracket for the pump. We're just going to cut this out using the cutoff wheel, and then we'll clamp it to the table and whack it with a hammer, bend it into shape. You might notice that this second bend isn't exactly straight, and that is intentional because where this is going to mount on the back of the car, we have a little bit of curvature from the bumper support. And with it straight, it wouldn't line up correctly. So that bend is intentional. Then we're going to come in, make some pilot holes using a 1/8 inch drill bit. That way we can test fit everything before we drill our final holes in case something is off or doesn't line up. We're putting it on the car with a set of Clecos here, and I'm mounting the pump. And this is just to test fit everything again before we drill the final holes. This way I can put the bumper on, make sure it fits, make sure we don't have any issues. Make sure if we have to move something, we can. And then once we're happy with that, we can take it all apart, pop the Clecos out, drill the holes, and then install our hardware and mount this permanently. Off camera, in between all that, I did paint this bracket with a coat of black paint just to make it look nice, a little bit of build quality, and prevents it from rusting. With that, we can get it mounted using Nylock hardware so it doesn't go anywhere. There's a lot of vibration back here, and I want to make sure it's solid. The last thing I want is this thing coming loose. I'm also mounting the pump using some rubber isolators. Stuart recommends against that. However, I haven't seen any issues with it. It does help cut down on some of the noise that's transmitted into the car. And this pump is a little loud. We're going to use those rubber isolators just to cut down on the noise. We can move back over to the tank. It's back from powder coat, and Ryan at 6651 Customs did an awesome job in this wrinkle black powder coat. So I'm installing the trim ring for the billet lid, and I just put a little bit of gray RTV underneath it, and then we'll tighten it down. That way we have a complete seal all the way around. There's actually a rubber gasket on the inside, so the lid will seal also once we put the lid on. This fitting is going to be a vent line, and we're going to run it just like you would on a fuel cell with a rubber hose with a loop that dumps out of the car. If you have one of the tanks that's mass manufactured and it leaks, especially in the summer, this is why. Not only do they use a lid that doesn't seal, but they do not have a vent. These tanks are going to sweat and swell in the summer, and you need a place to vent that pressure. Now this fitting is for our custom temp sensor from Reif Sensors. This is a water temperature sensor that emits a 0 to 5 volt output. So it's plug and play with HP tuners or an Aeroforce gauge. Once the tank is installed, we can start connecting all of our lines. This big line is our feed from the pump up into the front of the car, and this smaller line is our return that comes back down the side of the car and back into the tank. I'm just gonna put a couple gallons of water in it just to test it and burp it, make sure everything works the way it's supposed to. Once we get that couple gallons in it, we can turn the key on. We can't start the car obviously, but we can use an Aeroforce or HP tuners to turn the pump on since we wired it into the factory controls. And you'll see as we run the pump, and I'm gonna add another gallon of water here, you'll see all that air burp out of the system right here. And this one is good to go. This tank came out awesome. I love the way it looks and the way it fits. If you don't know that it's there, you can't even tell, and that makes all the difference in the world to me. Huge thanks to Aaron and Garage Fab for helping bend this tank up, and also to Ryan and 6651 Customs, who does all our powder coating. That's it for this one, but we'll have more videos on the ZL1, and I promise a return to Wriggle videos is coming very, very soon as well. If you have questions or comments, drop them below. And as always, don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram if you want a sneak peek at what we're working on now. Thanks, guys.